This new Super El Niño forecast changes everything. And I mean that literally, because this thing is outpacing every model we have, even the most aggressive ones out there. What's going on, Guy? Certified meteorologist Jonathan Kegg back with you. And there it is, the red on your screen. We're going to break this down and talk about what it means as we head into fall and winter, when the impacts of El Niño hit their peak. Drop in the comments where you're tuning in from and what your thoughts are, and let's jump straight into it. This is the sea surface temperature anomaly map, and it is boiling out there in the Central Pacific. We're most focused on the Niño 3.4 region, which stretches roughly from Hawaii, running parallel back toward the west coast of the United States. This is where the anomaly is now surging past degrees Celsius, at least for the latest weekly check-in. The new numbers just came out, and this is significant. We've talked about this at length for months now, back when people were saying, oh, it's the spring predictability barrier. There's no way we're going to be this warm in the Niño 3.4 region. Well, we are, and it's getting even warmer. More on that in a second. This is the latest model output, hot off the press, the newest European ensembles. We'll get into the ONI and RONI indices in just a moment too, but here's where we stand right now, already above 2 degrees Celsius. That's the anomaly for sea surface temperatures in that region of the equatorial Pacific, which works out roughly 6 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. We use Celsius in the weather world though, so let's stick with that. Look at the forecast here. This is 3 degrees, this is 4 degrees Celsius. Most of the ensembles, by the time this peaks in late fall or early winter, are surging beyond 4 degrees Celsius above normal. For the record, if we're using ONI, the strongest El Niño on record was about 2.8 something, way back in the late 1800s in the modern record. In 1997 to 1998 was about 2.75, give or take. That's using ONI. RONI is what we're using now. That's the relative index. And using that MA, EASURE, the pace we're on is surging beyond even the 1997 to 1998 event. So what does all of this mean? All those numbers, all the jargon with ONI and RONI, it has real impact on us. The question, as we move into the season where El Niño is most impactful for most of the world, fall and winter, is just how big that impact is going to be. Here's the issue. Yes, we could be talking about a record-shattering El Niño in terms of the departure from normal sea surface temperatures in the equatorial Pacific, but everything has to line up, and there are real questions about how significant the downstream effects will be, because it's not as cool back closer to Australia as it was in 97 on 98. That gradient isn't as sharp this time around, and you need that gradient for things to really get cooking. So the question becomes, what wins out? Here's the model forecast, and I like to keep you updated on this. Honestly, from the last time we did a video on El Niño about a month ago, not much has changed, which in itself tells you something. Let's start with October. We're going to go through North America first, then take a look at the rest of the world. In October, we start seeing the cool season impacts rear their head. Tropically speaking, it means more storms in the eastern and western Pacific and fewer in the Atlantic, which is exactly what we've seen. Now let's move to November. There are the signals. California wet, southeast wet. Watch what happens here. This is wild. We're already watching for severe weather potential in Florida by the time we get into winter. Maybe some flooding risk building in California. Dry conditions setting up in the Pacific Northwest, which is not what anyone wants given the ongoing fire situation out there. I know the last strong El Niño back in 2015-2016 wasn't kind to that pattern for the Pacific Northwest. It actually ended up wet. I think this time is different. There were other factors at play back then that counteracted the typical El Niño signal. This time the setup looks more textbook. Let's take you further out to January, talk about a skier's paradise potentially shaping up in the Sierra. This could be a wild winter coming our way, and it looks like that signal is going to hold. Temperature-wise, as we move through October, November, and Dece. MBR, I think we're going to bake through a lot of Canada, the northern and northeastern tier of the country, the northern plains, and the upper Midwest. Probably a crummy winter for snow lovers in a lot of those areas. There are some signals, and you've probably seen chatter about this across YouTube, that we'll have to watch closely. There's a chance of a polar vortex split showing up in some of the model guidance, which could send Coley de-air diving south. But by and large, if you're rooting for snow, especially along that I-95 corridor, you're going to need to time it out perfectly. We should have a stormy winter overall, but will there be enough cold to go with it? That's the number one ingredient for snow, and it's the one that's most in question right now. Here's a worldwide view of the same setup, and I wanted to show you this because it really puts on full display what El Niño does on a global scale. This is October. Let's take it to November. There's the increased rainfall over the equatorial Pacific because of those warmer waters sitting out there, driving a lot of extra rising motion. that extends its influence all the way back into the United States. Now watch what happens in South America. Very, very wet on the eastern side, and also along the Pacific coast as we move into early spring. The Philippines, on the other, our hand, trending mainly dry. That's one of El Niño's biggest calling cards. And then through the Sahel region in Africa, everything is shaping up to a T with what we'd expect from a classic El Niño pattern. The models are locking in on this. El Niño is going to be the dominant weather and climate feature going forward into the cool season of the Northern Hemisphere, running from late 2026 into early 2027. Now, obviously, there's a tropical flavor tied into all of this too. One of the things we've already watched play out is back-to-back Category 5 equivalents. In the Eastern Pacific, we had Genevieve, and in the Western Pacific, Typhoon D often reached Category 5 equivalent strength and is still out there. And all of those tracking lines you're seeing represent several more tropical cyclones expected to form in the Western Pacific. On the Eastern Pacific side, it's much of the same story with more storms lining up. We have been in a bit of a relative lull over the last stretch, but there are several more systems in the pipeline. 3 that are likely to spin up between now and August 16th, which is as far out as this particular Google DeepMind ensemble model runs. The impacts keep stacking, an extremely active Eastern and Western Pacific, paired with an extremely quiet Atlantic. And that combination looks like it's going to hold. This is just an insane update, honestly. As I mentioned earlier in the video, this El Niño got picked apart back in the spring because of that spring predictability barrier. A lot of skepticism, a lot of, there's no way this holds. I told you we'd come back to this point. The thing we identified early on was that we weren't just looking at the models. Models are guidance, they're not gospel. We were tracking the heat building below the ocean surface, tied to those westerly wind bursts that took all the warmth accumulated out near Tahiti and Australia and pushed it back toward the equatorial Pacific, and eventually into the eastern equatorial Pacific. We watched that happen in real time. We watched the warming outpace even the most aggressive models, and here we stand today, watching what is likely going to be the strongest El Niño on record. It may not even be close. The impacts, though, still remain to be fully seen. How does this balance out, given that it's not as cool closer to Australia and Tahiti as it was during past record events? It's going to be interesting to watch play out over the coming months, but significant impacts across a huge portion of the globe are certainly on the table. Let's dig a little deeper into why this matters so much, because a lot of people hear El Niño and think it's just a Pacific Ocean phenomenon that doesn't touch their daily life. That couldn't be further from the truth. El Niño reshapes global weather patterns for months at a time, and the stronger the event, the more dramatic and widespread those reshaping effects tend to be. When sea surface temperatures in the central and eastern Pacific run this far above normal, it fundamentally alters where thunderstorm activity concentrates near the equator, and that shift in tropical rainfall sends ripple effects through. The jet stream patterns across the entire globe. That's why we can sit here and talk about drought risk in the Philippines in the same breath as flooding risk in California and severe weather potential in Florida. It's all connected through the same atmospheric chain reaction. For folks here in the United States, the pattern we're watching typically means a more active, stronger subtropical jet stream diving across the southern tier of the country. That tends to bring more moisture and more storm systems into California, the Southwest, and the Gulf Coast Saint. Hate is through the winter months. It's part of why we're already flagging wet signals for California and the Southeast heading into November. At the same time, that stronger subtropical jet often comes at the expense of the Pacific Northwest, which tends to see a drier, milder pattern during strong El Niño winters. Again, not great news, given the fire situation already unfolding out there this year. Up across the northern tier, the northern plains, the upper Midwest, and into Canada, the classic El Niño signal points toward a milder, warmer than normal winter overall. That doesn't mean zero cold air, and that's where things get interesting this year, because there are some model signals hinting at a potential polar vortex, disruption or split later in the winter season. If that happens, it could allow cold air to spill south in a way that temporarily overrides the milder El Niño baseline. But timing that kind of event is incredibly difficult this far in advance, and it would likely be a shorter duration cold shot layered on top of an otherwise milder pattern, rather than a complete reversal of the overall trend. For the I-95 corridor specifically, where a lot of people are always asking about snow chances, this is going to be a season where storm track and moisture won't be the limiting factor. We should see plenty of storminess given the overall pattern. And cold air is going to be the wild card. If you get a storm tracking up the coast without enough cold air in place, you're looking at rain or a rain-snow mix instead of a foot of powder. That's the balancing act meteorologists are going to be watching closely storm by storm as we get into December, January, and February. On the tropical side, the contrast we're seeing right now between the Pacific basins and the Atlantic is a textbook El Niño signature. Strong El Niño events tend to increase wind shear across the tropical Atlantic, which makes it much harder for hurricanes to organize and strengthen there, even when ocean temperatures are warm. That's a big part of why the Atlantic has been so quiet relative to recent years. Meanwhile, that same atmospheric setup tends to reduce wind shear over the eastern and western Pacific Sea, which is exactly why we've seen this explosion of typhoon and hurricane activity out there, including multiple Category 5 equivalent systems already this season, with more storms lined up behind them in the model guidance. I also want to touch on the global agricultural and economic angle here, because that's often overlooked in day-to-day weather coverage. When you get a strong El Niño event like the one shaping up right now, it doesn't just mean a wetter winter in California or a quieter hurricane season in the Atlantic. It can meaningfully impact global crop yields, water supply, and commodity markets. Drier conditions across parts of Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, can strain heat production in a region that's a major global supplier. Wetter conditions across parts of South America can boost soybean and corn production in some areas while creating flooding problems in others. These are the kinds of ripple effects that go well beyond just whether you need a rain jacket or snow shovel this winter. Here's the honest bottom line as we sit here today. The Niño 3.4 region has already blown past 2 degrees Celsius above normal, and the latest ensemble guidance is pointing toward a peak beyond 4 degrees Celsius by late fall or early winter. If that verifies, we are talking about potentially the STR on guest El Niño event on record, surpassing even the historic 1997-1998 event when measured using the relative index. The models have been consistently underestimating how fast this thing would strengthen, and the Super B-surface ocean heat data backed that up well before the models caught on. That's not a small thing. That's the kind of signal that tends to translate into real, tangible impacts once we get deeper into the season. What we don't have fully locked in yet is exactly how sharp the broader temperature gradient across the Pacific Basin is going to end up being, because that gradient plays a major role in how intensely the atmospheric response plays out on a GL. Obol scale. It's not as cool near Australia and Tahiti right now as it was during past record-setting events, and that's the piece forecasters are going to be watching most closely over the next several weeks and months. But make no mistake, with warming this far ahead of pace, and with the pattern already showing up clearly in the forecast guidance for October, November, December, and beyond, this is shaping up to be the dominant story in global weather and climate for the back half of this year and into early next year. So here's what I want you to take away from all of this. If you're on the West Coast, especially California, get ready for a potentially very active and wet winter pattern with an elevated flooding risk in spots. If you're in the Pacific Northwest, watch for a drier stretch that could complicate the ongoing wildfire situations. On before winter, moisture eventually arrives. If you're across the northern plains, upper Midwest, and into the Northeast, expect a milder baseline winter overall, but don't rule out a sharp, shorter duration cold snap if that polar vortex signal ends up verifying. And if you're anywhere near the Gulf Coast or the Southeast, keep an eye on an active subtropical storm track through the winter months. On the tropical side, expect the imbalance to continue. A hyperactive eastern and western Pacific with more typhoons and hurricanes likely to develop, and a comparatively quiet Atlantic hurricane season continuing through its remaining weeks. And globally, keep an eye on how this plays out across South America, the Philippines, and parts of Africa, because those regions tend to feel some of the most dramatic and consistent El Niño impacts anywhere on the planet. This is a fast-moving, historically significant event, and I'll keep tracking it closely as new model runs and new ocean data come in. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. Drop your questions in the comments, let me know where you're watching from, and I will catch you in the next video.